Stanley Kramer spent 20 years ahead of his time. And then when the rest of the world caught up to him, he was behind the time. But during that 20 years, he was unique. He was a liberal, progressive filmmaker at a time when that was very dangerous to do so. And he made what are now called message pictures. But they were wonderful movies. He, believed in the spoonful of sugar idea that you can get the message across if you make an entertaining picture. And some of his pictures really helped to shape attitudes of American life. And for that, we owe him a great deal. I mean, it's not just that he made entertaining pictures, but also that he did help change the nation a little bit. Kramer started out in the 30s doing all kinds of things. He got to hone his filmmaking style a little bit when he got into the Army and did some training films and stuff. And when he got out, he wanted to get into the picture industry. It was not an easy thing to do. And he happened to do this at a good time in the late 40s because television was now making inroads. The major studios had to get rid of their theater chains. And there was a stodginess creeping into the ranks of the Louis B. Mayers and the Harry Cohens. And they were kind of a little nervous about letting new talent in. So he realized, as did many others in that era, that the way to go was to form an independent production company, make your own films, and then try and make a deal with a studio, a distributor. And he was very fortunate in that regard because there was United Artists, which was desperate for product at that time. So here comes a guy who wants to make interesting pictures and has learned how to do them well on a low budget, and they said, yeah, we like this. And that was basically his foot in the door. He started a production company with Carl Foreman and George Glass, and they would make pictures one at a time, sort of handcrafted the old-fashioned way. And by and large, they tried to make movies on subjects that the studios were just reluctant to really tackle, especially in an era where a HUAC was really coming into play and everybody was looking over their shoulders. The unfriendly 10 had already been sent to jail. So they were already, at the very beginning, being very daring and taking on topics like racism with Home of the Brave. Now, of course, back in the glory days of Hollywood, there was the old saying, if you want to send a message, use Western Union. Occasionally, a message film would slip by, but there was usually a reason for it. The Grapes of Wrath had been a best-selling novel. John Ford, with that and other pictures that he made, had the clout to be able to get those things made. And also he worked very inexpensively. And sometimes they would kind of look the other way. He says, well, we can't lose too much on this. All right, Crossfire, the RKO picture, which was about anti-Semitism. That was a very small budget picture, which turned out to be a big hit. So Kramer and Foreman found themselves in the right place at the right time, said we can capitalize on this semi-vacuum and make more interesting pictures about things that people need to be thinking about. In 1951, Kramer, having had several successes independently, was approached by Columbia to set up a production company there. This was partly due to the Columbia board worried that Harry Cohen was getting on in years and they needed a line of succession. And they thought that because Kramer had been a successful producer, he might be in a position to step in and take over the studio someday. And Kramer liked the idea because he thought if he had a steady supply of income and didn't have to worry so much about every jot and tittle, he would be able to finally start directing on his own. So he signed this production deal with Harry Cohen, which he later said was the biggest mistake he ever made in his life. Because for one thing, Cohen wouldn't let him direct because he was too busy producing. But on the other hand, Cohen did give him freedom. It was in the contract. So even though Cohen hated a lot of the pictures he made, he had no choice but to go along with him. And as it happened, an awful lot of the pictures Kramer made for Columbia lost money. And the great irony was that the last picture he did, The Caine Mutiny, was such a huge hit that it wiped out all the losses from all the previous films, so it ended up being a break even. In fact, the biggest money loser, ironically, is now probably the most famous and beloved picture of the ones he made at Columbia, which is The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T, a musical fantasy based on a Dr. Seuss story. High Noon came together around 1951. The ironic thing is that Kramer loved the title High Noon because it had a lot of impact, but it wasn't applicable to anything he was doing at the time. And then Foreman came up with the idea of a Western and came up with a story. Now, as it turned out, there had been a magazine story very similar to that, so Kramer bought the rights to that story just to make sure his ass was covered. You had this peculiar situation of a Western being written, produced, and directed by people who had never made a Western before. And they were kind of the attitude that, well, it's not really a Western. It takes place in the West, but it's not really a Western. And to some extent, that's true. A lot of the tropes that we associate with Westerns, stagecoach holdup, barroom brawl, none of that's in there except for the climactic shootout. There's really not much there that marks it as a Western. It's really a suspense picture that does take place in the Old West, as he said. The whole Kramer-Foreman situation is a great tragedy, and it's been explored, in documentaries and elsewhere. And I don't know that we're ever going to know the whole truth. And it's especially sad because you had two people who were basically on the same side. They had the same beliefs, the same philosophies, the same intents. They wanted to make quality movies that were about something and perhaps, move a progressive agenda forward. The big difference between Foreman and Kramer was that Foreman had been a member of the Communist Party at one time. He hadn't stayed for very long and he left, but it was there on his permanent record. Kramer had never joined the Communist Party. Foreman never told Kramer about this. Maybe he didn't think it was important. So while High Noon is in production, Foreman is called in to testify. And Kramer was a little bit hurt when he found out that Foreman never told him he was a member of the Communist Party. So Foreman testified, and he invoked his Fifth Amendment rights. He admitted he'd been a member of the Communist Party, but he wouldn't name names. And realizing what was going to happen, he just packed up and moved to England while they were in the middle of production. And Kramer was very upset, and because he left in mid-production, he removed Foreman's name as producer of the film. His name remained on as a screenplay writer, of course. And that infuriated Foreman, and the two men never spoke again. Foreman was doomed either way. Even if he'd stayed in the country, he would have been blacklisted. He wouldn't have been able to work unless he was writing, with somebody acting as a front. Every way was wrong. There was no good solution. And in fact, if you think about it, probably the way it played out was the best for all concerned, because Kramer emerged basically unscathed and was able to continue to make movies. And he was one of the first people to help break the blacklist. Everybody argues about Dalton Trumbo, writing Exodus and Spartacus, but let's not forget that 2 years earlier, Ned Young and Harold Jacob Smith were credited for the screenplay of The Defiant Ones when they were still on the blacklist too. So Kramer deserves some credit for that as well. So again, it was just an unfortunate situation in which everybody lost to some extent. And there's no victory here except for the forces of evil. And fortunately, even their day came to an end. Kramer had a good relationship with Fred Zinnemann. They actually made several pictures together. Kramer was a very hands-on producer. He involved himself in every aspect of filmmaking. Now, he hired the best, and he didn't micromanage them, but he made it clear how he wanted things to proceed. And people recognized that he was a very brilliant man and a very creative man. And if he made a suggestion, it was usually the right one. Now, the post-production of the picture is swirled in mystery, and I'm not sure we'll ever know what happened. It is generally agreed upon that the first preview went very badly, and part of the problem was that it was way too long. Even allowing for the real-time aspect, it was like 20 to 25 minutes longer than it should have been. Obviously, the film needed to be recut. Now we come to the question of who recut it. Did Williams do it? Did Kramer and Gerstadt together do it? Nobody seems to know. Even in his autobiography, Kramer is vague. He just says, we recut it. From what I understand, Williams basically made the last 60 minutes in real time, and then the first 25 minutes are a little bit more spread out. Then there was a great deal of laughter at a preview. And part of that was because, well, not part of it, practically all of it was because of the damn song. Because they were just using it over and over and over again. It was like every 5 minutes, do not forsake me, oh my darling, and the audience. And Kramer said, okay, and they took it down to about a quarter. So the song only came up occasionally, and that's when it worked. Now, Kramer had always wanted to direct, but when you're making pictures one at a time, you really can't focus on it. And he thought that the deal at Columbia would eventually allow him to direct. But Cohen said, no, you can't direct. You're too busy producing all these movies. He was doing several pictures a year. So when the Columbia deal finally was dissolved, he went back to United Artists, with the proviso that he would now be his own director. And United Artists, sure, fine. As long as it came in on schedule, on budget, and was of a certain quality, which they knew he was capable of, it didn't matter to them if he directed it or Fred Zinnemann directed it. And of course, Zinnemann had already won an Oscar for From Here to Eternity, so his own career was pretty well established, and he really didn't need Kramer anymore, and Kramer really didn't need him. And Kramer was content now, finally, to direct, and that's what he did pretty much for the rest of his career. He still produced an occasional outside picture, but directing was what he really felt he wanted to do, and now he was doing it. Now, Kramer's success as a director was, for the most part, prestige and artistic. He did 4 tremendous films in a row in the late 50s and early 60s. But they weren't making a lot of money. Even though they were relatively inexpensive, they were all in black and white, but they did have big stars in them, which were costly. They weren't making the money. And United Artists was concerned, and they said, we can't keep funding these pictures unless something is profitable. And at the same time, Bosley Crowther, who was the critic for the New York Times, kind of challenged Kramer. He said, you know, why don't you do something else? Why don't you do a comedy? I'll bet you can't even do a comedy. So Kramer decided, all right, I'm gonna show you, I'm gonna make the best goddamn comedy you've ever seen. And Kramer went out and he made the best goddamn comedy he'd ever seen, which was, of course, It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, the greatest movie ever. And yet, Kramer being Kramer, it was a message picture. It was about greed. It was about how ordinary citizens, tempted by the thought of easy money, just went completely berserk and would break all kinds of laws. And at the same time, there was also this subplot about surveillance, because the cops are always watching what they're doing. And especially today, where, you know, we're all being spied on, it really was ahead of its time in that regard, too. So even as you're laughing your ass off, you are still thinking. And that's the genius of Kramer. I mean, that wasn't a spoonful of sugar, that was a 5-pound bag of sugar. After that, he reverted to type with Ship of Fools, which was sort of a grand hotel on an ocean liner set during the early days of World War II. And it was a soap opera, but again, you had the Nazis and the whole things with Jews and everything. And that was very successful. And then 2 years later, he went back to racism and back to comedy and made Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which was an enormous groundbreaker in the friendly hands of Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn and Sidney Poitier. America really started to look twice at this whole thing and said, you know, you're right, it's no big deal. Kramer's reputation has kind of been up and down a lot. I know his widow, Karen, has worked a lot to help restore it. But the best thing to that are the movies themselves. They still hold up. I mean, my God, every time It's a Mad, 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 Mad World shows in LA or elsewhere, the theaters are jammed, and people who know the movie by heart are still laughing. They're still applauding at the appearance of every familiar face, which means there's constant applause. And the pictures are still screened. They're still relevant, even though they were rooted in an era managed to be timeless. Now, of course, a lot of that is due to the writing, and also the fact that he used great actors whose reputations continue. So that also brings people back. But perhaps in some indirect way, it's sort of like telling us that we will always be fighting these fights. And that even though I'm no longer here corporeally, my films are still here to kind of light the torch and bring you out of the darkness.